Okay, so who wants to start by asking a question to another speaker? Maybe I can start. That would be a possibility. So I was wondering about this issue that was raised a number of times, particularly and more recently in Christophe's presentation, but also before, on the dissociation and dissociability of syntax and semantics, which is, of course, an important issue. And I was wondering how good the use of Jabberwocky is for that purpose. It seems to me that it's very hard to really set meaning, lexical meaning aside, right? So when we hear a Jabberwocky sentence, we immediately struggle to try to attribute some kind of meaning. Maybe we are talking about a bizarre bird that we have never encountered before, or we really do our best to assign meaning to these structures. So it seems to me that perhaps what we are really testing with these structures is the structure and function of the functional lexicon, because the functional lexicon is there, right? And the functional lexicon is what determines the glue of the configuration, fundamentally. And that's a very important question. How does the functional lexicon work? I mean, do we find anything comparable to the functional lexicon in animals, for instance, right? Or is that a very specifically human property? So one could think of the use of Jabberwocky as a way of testing the role and properties of the functional lexicon. I don't know if there is any comment on that, or on the more general issue of the syntax semantics dissociation.
Well, if I may just add one little thing to what Luigi said, may I? May I?
Yes, of course. Go ahead.
I myself had the same question on working with Jabberwocky, with the gold Kampfbrowse and this kind of things. But there is actually one possibility in order to disentangle syntax and meaning, and in fact, even syntax and sound, that is to go the other way around. In a recent experiment with a group, we paired sequences of words that have exactly the same sound, but completely different syntax. So as, for example, in Italian, la porta, which means the door or brings her. In that case, what you actually compare is exactly the opposite that you do with the Jabberwocky. Namely, you do compare two elements which are taken from the lexicon, and the first one has a completely different syntactic role. But you can strip away the sound component, and what is there should be a pure syntactic difference. That in that case, the one that that opposes pronouns to articles. So there could be another option to the one of using the Jabberwocky in order to compare, to disentangle the two components.
May I say one thing? In my case, when I used Jabberwocky, it was not so much to get rid of semantics, because for one thing, I've always thought that Jabberwocky sentences have logical form, and maybe logical form is part of semantics. But when I used it precisely to compare sentences versus destructured list of words, it was to get rid of transition probabilities. Because if you take a sentence and compare it to a list of words, the transition probability between words inside a well-formed sentence is higher than in a list of, it would be very difficult to equate them. By using Jabberwocky, I could get rid of local transition probabilities. So I just want to make clear that we don't always use Jabberwocky to get rid of semantics, because indeed we find it difficult. Now, many people tell me that Jabberwocky sentences evoke content. In my case, I've realized recently that I am aphantasic. That is, I don't form any mental picture I clearly see the logical form of a Jabberwocky sentence, but I really don't build any visual representation of a Jabberwocky sentence.
If I may also add a compliment, so with Yair Lacrest and other colleagues, we are currently analyzing intracranial recordings of Jabberwocky versus normal sentences. And it's a bit like you described, so we don't find areas or barely find electrodes where there is a response to sentences and not to Jabberwocky. Unfortunately, I would say it'd be nice if it was the case, but it's not the case. In fact, it's, first of all, virtually all electrodes respond to Jabberwocky, but they respond slightly more slowly, as if this was a sort of extreme of low-frequency words. So it's still very interesting for the reason you suggest, that there is forcing of these pseudo-words into a noun or a verb as a function of the surrounding functional categories. But also we have electrodes that have more activation for Jabberwocky. This is something that I did not envisage at the beginning. Makes complete sense when you think of reading these items. They are pseudo-words. There are additional processes of attention and letter-by-letter reading. So the story is more complicated, unfortunately, than what we had in mind in 2011. The result was a bit too clean-cut, I think. Yeah.
May I add a tiny thing? Unless, in the naturalistic stimuli, like listening to a story, I compared activation to function words versus content words. And you typically find more activation in the Broca's area, I'm sorry, for function words than for content words.
May I just make a brief sort of follow-up comment on that? I feel like there's potentially a certain, there's actually potentially unity between that finding that you're describing and the work, of course, on that Stan that you described on minimum description length prediction of the degree of activation and that is obtained for the different patterns that you expose people to, depending on the complexity of the pattern. And I mean, indeed, our earlier work on surprisal, our view has been very much that it's you can think of the complexity there as the complexity of what you're processing in real time as the description length of the additional description length that's required to integrate new input into context. And so really, I think all of, that is, in probabilistic grammar, that's very explicit in terms of the probabilities of different rules that are required to engage. In a neural model where rules are implicit, that's going on implicitly. So it seems actually that there's potentially great consistency between all those points of view. It's that basically the brain is optimized to encode and encode what it gets in context efficiently. And that's harder for some materials based on basically coding principles.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, it's already present in the literature on vision, this idea that vision is about compressing. So there's a long evolutionary history, presumably, of compressing, but the idea is that humans found an additional trick to compress even better.
But I think there's additionally, beyond that, I think it's important to distinguish lossy versus lossless compression, right? So the issues, I mean, in a sense, I think the predominant view of compression and vision is actually about lossy compression, where it's distinguishing what you need to encode and retain versus information that you need to discard. And it's actually not clear that that plays a key role in the kind of like sequence representation problems that you're describing, or even the representation of a sentence. It's not clear that we actually lose much information about the word sequence itself when we lose some because we have memory constraints, but it's not clear that we're actually pruning away a large chunk of that. Whereas in the vision case, I think it's very compelling that like lossy compression is sort of the main story.
Is still William with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, I had a question that Stan blocked me. So before leaving, I would like to formulate that. I don't know if it's the right time. Other people have not the chance to speak, so I may be the last one, but I want to address it.
Go for it.
Okay, so there is one aspect that you maintain as constant in your very thought-challenging talk, and that is the idea that externalization is one single operation that sends, in a minimalist way, the structure out to the external world. It seems to me that although this was very useful at a certain point of the research, this idea that externalization is the monolithic operation is empirically untenable for at least two reasons. One reason comes from formal syntax. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Richard Kane, but he argued I think, in a conclusive way that in order to understand the impossibility of certain exceptions in the verbal system of English, for example, the fact you cannot say goat, but you have to say went, he has a long argument that boils down to the idea that phonology feeds syntax. I know this is thought-provoking, but then, on the other hand, there is a convergent piece of evidence that I myself tried to argue for. That is that during inner speech, where of course you don't have any externalization, you nevertheless have sound representation. So it seems to me that the rigid idea that there is one single operation of externalization is untenable. You have at least to have two different operations. One that is sound representation, and that is, in a sense, reviving the original Saussurean way of thinking that the sign is a combination of sound and meaning, and the other, which is the motor planning that is activated in order to externalize. I think that these ingredients should be brought in and revise the architecture of the model of language computation in the brain. I don't know what you think of that.
So the first point is above my pay grade, but I do know that Chomsky is fond of pointing out, Richie Kane's analysis, sort of pointing to, at some level, the inertness of linear order, and either that being encoded via constraint or just simply not in the representation at all, according to his theory, but that's, above my pay grade. The second point you make, I don't want to claim there's a monolithic operation whatsoever. I would suggest that there's a cascade of operations, none of the subsequent operations are necessarily obligated, right? So you could encode the representation at some abstract level of, morphological sequences or phonology without the phonetic instantiation or overt articulation. So I think that makes perfect sense. And if I had more time, I would have gone into more detail about the neuroanatomical basis of that.
But notice that the struggle, the tension between the Chomsky proposal and the Kanean proposal is about where linearization is needed, which is a different fact with respect to where the phonological information is computed. You can have phonological information independently for linearization, which is as simple as the fact that when you pronounce dog, without having the promolarializing words, you have to have a certain phonological features. Kanean approach is very interesting because, he proposes that the merging of the engine that merges features at the phonological level, at the engine that merges features at the morphosyntactic level is exactly the same. If that is true, it means that we have to really revise the 19th century-like idea of, a sequential model of language, hierarchical in the sense of morphemes, phonemes, and blah, blah, blah. Sorry, phoneme, morphemes, and blah, blah, blah.
So I have a question to ask you, actually, and I think it might... Oh, was it me? Oh, maybe. And I think it might relate to the question Stefan asked, though I'm not sure. So in the language of thought, in terms of which you measure complexity, one thing I wonder is how dependent your results, how dependent are they on the specific choice of language of thought? Or because, so if you started from different primitives, could you expect completely different things? And for instance, if you try to measure the complexity of the figures from, I don't know, the complexity of some network that represent them, or even some description of this network in terms of which, would it change a lot of things or not?
Yes, of course it would, yeah. So we're trying to, first of all, have a minimum of primitives, and those that seem to be really needed to capture the domain. And the second is, I showed you at least one experiment where we tested a generic prediction, regardless of the language. When you recurse there is this complexity, summative relation, additive relation. That should be true of any language, basically. So that has been the approach. But you're right. I mean, part of the name of the game is also to find the perfect language. We did that in the case of the binary sounds. So I showed only one experiment out of a paper that has 6, where we end up really like almost perfectly fitting the human data with a language that is in fact a little bit different from what he had in mind initially, because it starts with groups, and then it creates groups of groups of groups of groups like this. So yeah, I mean, there is also a sort of game of the details of those languages, and I don't think we're quite there yet for the shapes. I was very interested in the discussion, by the way, on, your presentation, also the presentation on quantifiers, suggesting that we need something like set theory. We should probably add set theory and logic to what we put in our languages. And for some reason, they all seem to belong together to this sort of mass network. I'm not sure why.
And it looks in this language of thought that you had things that were a bit like content words, which were the shapes, and other things that were functions, right, like repeat, and is that true?
Yeah, to some extent, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Let me add one
I
thing
have
on
a
this.
question for Stan. Can I ask a question? I think it's related. For Stan, for the experiment in which one had to predict the position of the circle or the penguin, I don't remember anymore what it was.
The fish?
So, and then you showed us that, there is this zigzag patterns and people develop a symbolic representation of it where you kind of partition the graph into 2 subsets and you're going. So if really people partition the graph into, basically they create a bipartite graph, you should find the same patterns, neural patterns for any bipartite graph. Have you tried that?
I suppose it's very similar to what we did in terms of decoding number 1 versus number 2, yes. So what counted as number 1 and as number 2 could change in location completely depending on how this zigzag rotated and so on. So yes, to some extent that's, related to what we did, yes, absolutely. And yeah, in a certain sense it's a form of graph theory if you would like, but it's more of a sort of programming language that compresses the graph. Yeah.
I just wanted to add a little comment on the exchange on the language of thought. And that relates to Gennaro's talk, in fact. So Gennaro at some point raised the issue, in Chinese we have dou. What does that correspond to in, let's say, English or French and so on? And that's a question that systematically arises if you do comparative work. You want to know what corresponds to what when you move from one language to the other. The fact that you can do that sort of thing, after all, because otherwise, comparative linguistics would not exist, suggests that we have something against which we check whether or not something is the same or is different, right? And this somehow leads us to the primitive elements of semantic computation, of syntactic computation that I think Gennaro was suggesting, saying that in some languages we actually see that there is a complex entity because we see it in the complex morphology, whereas in other languages we see just one item, but that corresponds to this richer morphology. So I wanted to ask Gennaro if he has any further thought on this issue. This is really a very crucial issue for comparative linguistics, I believe.
Well, it's very hard because it's how change is encoded and what is the overarching structure. So in this complex domain of these very peculiar quantifiers that appear to be the real signature in natural language, you wind up, this was also pretty evident in Benjamin's, variant of this. So the skeleton that you find is very general, and it's a skeleton with a basic quantifier and a higher order quantifier, and then the range of conditions vary also in a limited way. And the border, for instance, think about exclusivity versus mirativity. Okay, so exclusivity says roughly that something like only this sentence and what it entails is true. So if something is true, it must be entailed. And mirativity says something about probability, right? Something about low expectation. So it's a different order, right? It's a different way of ordering pieces of information. And all the game is this, right? So in Benjamin's presentation, he mentioned, either you get a contradiction or you get lack of informativity, right? So you have this skeleta, this sort of logical skeleta, which have a small sets of variants. And, we cannot agree yet on the ultimately best way of doing it, but these components are there. So, the actual shape of the condition, mirative, additive, exclusive, the type of alternatives, the mode of exhaustification. Does it take presuppositions into account or not? Does it, predicate truth or not? The ultimate mystery to me remains how inference comes about, right? So you have the functional lexicon where all of these spots are hidden, and the real strength of the functional lexicon is not so much in the hierarchical structure per se, but is in what inference does it license. And that is really, hard, how inference supervenes on a structure building device, which is what merge gives. I'm sorry for the terrible confusion, but we are making progress in unpacking these things.
Christophe.
I do have a question for people who are knowledgeable about NLP models with embeddings, sentence embeddings, or word embeddings. And this is actually a question I think Benjamin asks at the end of his talk is, how do you represent not? Well, the negation. If you have a sentence like this is red and then this is not red, what happens? If you stay in the same space, you are just adding a component to the vector? And what happens when you have double negations and something like that? Anybody knows? Maybe Marco, Roger, Emmanuel? I'm looking at you guys.
I don't think anything special happens. There are tasks of entailment. And so one of the entailment tasks is to detect contradiction, for example. And it's quite clear that the negation there is not treated in any special way. It's just easily confused with its non-negated element, contrapositive. So as far as I know, these logical words and logical elements are not treated in a logical way. As far as I know, you can set up pairs of sentences and train the network to distinguish these entailments, contradictions, or logical entailment. But in a way, it's trained on the words.
So can you mislead these networks when you, by adding, so it's going to be good at entailment, for instance, lexical entailment, so for instance, water entails liquid and things like this. Are you going to actually mislead some of these networks by adding negation in various places, or?
Yeah, maybe other people know better, but I think you could, yeah.
I can say something about this if it would be helpful. I think so there's definitely a lot of work that shows that if you basically that sort of this quote unquote state of the art models for the entailment task, which Paola mentioned, which is one of the most widespread tasks for this, that you can fool models based on especially substrings. Substrings, if they look superficially like a Q, that would lead you in one direction. If more globally, the global context actually should give a different interpretation, the models can get quite fooled. I would suggest that the most important thing to keep in mind is, and actually Benjamin, I thought you in your talk did a really great job of sort of characterizing this, that the embedding representations that are learned for a word are, you want to think them relative to the task that was set up that led to the word embedding representations. So, when you build these very large scale, and the fact of the matter is that the most successful models are what drives them is they have a huge amount of data to train on. But when you use all that data, you're constrained in the task that you can set up. Now, it turns out that the word prediction task is an incredibly effective task at extracting a lot of linguistic information from text about what representation you might want for a word, and how you might get that in a way that generalizes. So the word prediction task is basically words in context. But I think it's important to keep in mind that at the end of the day, it's not a meaning task. It's a prediction task. And so you would get different representations with different tasks. And I think that you want to keep that in mind. So there's no one word embedding representation, and depending on the task, they will look different. You can combine these kinds of models with tree structures as well. And so you can have hierarchical composition along a syntactic structure with vector composition operations. And then you can get rather different embeddings. And so, for example, some of the early work on sentiment analysis, asking whether a movie review was a movie review positive or not, there you actually got some sort of better treatment of negation because you had the syntactic tree and the composition was going along those. But it turns out that even bigger data sets make the models even better in terms of the standard NLP methods. So the main thing I would just keep in mind is the word embedding should be understood relative to the task that they came from.
So I heard that sentiment analysis indeed can be fooled extremely easily, even now. I'm not sure if it's true, but of course, it's interesting because there is enormous pressure for the industry in this case to get it right? And if someone says, I didn't hate this movie, you get double negations all the time, right? What I heard, but I don't know about the recent state of affairs, is that it remains very, very difficult, right?
Well, the performance is very high. It's just that the commercial applications live and die based on the distribution of what reviews look like. And the distribution of reviews, it turns out, doesn't look like what a linguist would write to try to fool a sentiment analysis system. And that sort of drives, that drives where the sort of the large scale applications get developed and what weak points remain.
So I think there seems to be a generalization among many of the presentations, and this is kind of a question for everyone, that with massive amounts of training data, these models can succeed to a very large extent, but then on particular key examples or questions, there's a failure, sometimes in a dramatic way. And then likewise, in what Stan presented regarding the baboons, right? Massive amounts of training data, some success, and then failure in particular example situations. But in the situation, the hypothetical that both the computer models or some other organism with massive amounts of training data would succeed, what would be the conclusion? Let's say all the questions that we've been asking about these, particular cases, like the parasitic gaps that failed on the parsing task, or the negation, or other situations. Let's say the models all succeeded, given their current organization and training data. What would be the conclusion then? What would we think then? Like, would we be satisfied that this is a good model of human linguistic competence, or would we not? Or what would be the next step from there?
I have a strong opinion on this. Can I express it? I think that for the moment, it would simply show that we have very good language models, because I really think that it really depends on how we train these models. And as Roger said, for the moment, we're training them in a fairly supervised fashion, actually. I disagree with Emmanuel Dupuy there. I mean, masking is a form of supervision. They're language models. And in fact, when you do these GPT-3 experiments, I mean, Joe showed yesterday, and I have done some myself, you really see that they have this superficially really impressive performance. And if you probe how much they understand of the words they're using, it's actually not very much. But I think that the kind of tasks that Stan has been showing, and I've been thinking about something along very similar lines, is really the way to go. So we can do the same thing that he's been doing with humans and baboons. We can do it with the networks. We can train them. So he has shown the convolutional neural network, and I don't know how it was trained, but we can really think about the way we train the networks and try to train them for tasks that are more intelligent. Either linguistically intelligent or structured tasks, and hopefully that will bring them to a slightly different level of qualitative level of performance, because otherwise you just have to increase to the data sets to something that becomes linguistically uninteresting and that we have only for 2 or 3 languages.
Okay, so I think we are tired. We have discussed a lot. We have learned a lot. I personally learned a lot. So I think it's a good time to close. Let me just add that I'd like to thank a few people who were really very helpful for the organization of this event. Theo Debord, who took care of the webinar, and Frédéric Berthelot, who helped a lot with the logistics, and Francisco Valderrama and the whole team of Collège de France for the technical part. So thank you very much, and thank you all for creating this opportunity that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you.